Welcome to the Norris Group Real Estate Podcast, a show committed to bringing you insights from thought leaders shaping the real estate industry. In each episode, we'll dive into conversations with industry experts and local insiders, all aimed at helping you thrive in an ever-changing real estate market, continuing the legacy that Bruce Norris created, sharing valuable knowledge, and empowering you on your real estate journey. Whether you're a seasoned pro or a newcomer, this is your go-to source for insider tips, market trends, and success strategies. Here's your host, Craig Evans.
All right, we are here today with Erik Hernandez, the Senior Vice President and Principal of Lee & Associates, Ontario. Erik, also known as the Warehouse Whisperer, focuses on industrial real estate. His specialties include active tenant buyer representation, landlord representation, land sales, and development and investment sales and analysis. Erik's real estate career now spans 20 plus years in the Inland Empire, having been involved in over $1 billion worth of commercial real estate transactions during his career. Erik is known as an expert in the Inland Empire industrial real estate for his knowledge and analysis. He's been a guest speaker and moderator at many local and regional business events over the years. Erik brings a unique perspective to the review and analysis of the commercial real estate market. He previously directed the market research efforts for Lee & Associates offices and another firm from 1995 through 2000 before transitioning to the real estate brokerage side of the business with Lee & Associates of Ontario in 2000. Erik enjoys giving back to the community and is a supporter of several organizations in the Inland Empire. He is a past member of the board of directors for the Inland Empire United Way, has been a supporter of the YMCA, the Chaffee College Scholarship Award, and has been a coach and certified referee for the local AYSO in Rancho.
That is true.
Erik, that is a bio, my friend. So I got to get into this. Erik, the Warehouse Whisperer. First of all, it's rare that you spent most or just about all of your career with one company. But before we get into all of that, I have to know about Erik the person. Tell me how you got the nickname Warehouse Whisperer.
So probably, maybe 10 years ago, I was part of a networking group where we would get together, and a really close group of people, and we would come up with little intros for ourselves, right? And one day, there was a few that I used that, didn't stick at all. And one day I used that, and everybody got a chuckle, and I used it a few more times. And then, one of my good friends there came up to me and he said, "Erik, I don't think you realize that's like really good. You should trademark that." And I chuckled like, "No, what are you talking about?" And then maybe a few weeks later, I was like, well, maybe I should. And I, go on Google and I started searching the term, and no one had it, right? Like there was no website, like there was no registration. So I called an attorney friend of mine and I said, "Hey, I need your help on, helping me figure out how to, trademark this, right?" And so he got one of his partners involved that specialized in, patent and trademark work, and we processed it through the U.S. Patent and trademark office, and I think it took over a year to actually get it through, because there were a few different rounds of submittals, where when you submit, you're saying, "Hey, I want this to cover all these categories," and they kicked it back. They said, "We can give you all of these, but we can't give this particular one because I think there's a guy in Florida that does building inspections," right? So it didn't cover building inspections, I think, but everything else, regarding, real estate and brokerage and pertaining to that and marketing services, and there's a whole list of categories it falls under. That's where it lands up. So in my home office, I got a little, thing from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office saying the Warehouse Whisperer.
So listen, I know you've got a long history with the Norris Group and especially with the radio show. You've been on several times with Bruce, and you and I have not had the opportunity to meet in person. So really appreciate you coming on today, spending time with us. Tell me, are you originally from the Inland Empire area?
I am. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I was born at the old Kaiser Hospital in Fontana.
Okay.
I grew up in Colton and Grand Terrace.
Okay.
Graduated Colton High School in class of 1991, and then I attended UC Riverside
Okay.
and graduated from there with a business degree in 1995.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm local boy, born and raised. At that point in time, Colton and Grand Terrace, there was only one high school. So Colton High School was our school. I think today I'd probably go to Grand Terrace High School because at that point in time, I lived in Grand Terrace, but I lived in both Colton and Grand Terrace over the years. And I just kind of local guy, born and raised.
Growing up, what did you think your career in that area growing up? What did you think your career was going to be?
I actually thought I was going to be a doctor. My mom was a nurse, and I thought that, well, she's a nurse, I'll be a doctor, right? And actually, funny story, I was at the time, UC Riverside, they have their own medical school that's getting up and running now. But back then, they had what was called the biomedical sciences program. And basically, you would apply to the biomed program, going into college. You'd do 2 years of that. And then I think the third year or fourth year, you would transfer to UCLA and basically fast track into the medical school there at UCLA because UCR didn't have its own. And it was super competitive. I think they started with 300 or 400 students, and I think 28 or 30 got it, right? So 90%, didn't make it.
Right.
And I thought, well, that's what I'm going to do. And my mom set up a surgery rotation with one of her doctor friends just to kind of say, hey, you can take a look at, do a surgery round and observe. And I scrubbed up and I went in for observation. And one of the observation rooms I saw, they were doing a particular operation. I won't describe all the details because it was pretty gruesome, but I realized that at that moment in time that I could not stand the sight of blood. Yeah, it was just awful. I realized at that moment that I was never going to be a doctor at that moment in time.
So at best you were going to pass out Band-Aids, right? That's it.
It was, and I think at that point in time, I was actually already working at Loma Linda University Medical Center in the pharmacy there as a courier, right? So I was already in at the ground floor, and I knew that was not going to be my path. And so then I thought I was going to be, I thought I'd switch and maybe be an attorney because I did speech and debate in high school at Colton High School at the time.
Okay.
With academic competition, and we had just probably one of the top 5 teachers and influences at that point in time in my life from an academic standpoint was this guy named Bob DeGroff, and he was this holdover hippie liberal from the 60s and 70s with like a long beard, and I don't think I ever heard him raise his voice once. He's a pretty soft-spoken guy. And if anybody ever had him, about halfway through the year, you would get the story from him about how he had battled lung cancer, and beat it. And it was a very inspirational story. And he would suck on cough drops all day because he had a constant cough the whole time.
Right.
Or it would flare up. But just influences from people like that, and got me interested in maybe becoming an attorney. And then as I went through college, I shifted my focus to, being a business major because there were things that interested me, about doing that. And that was the path that I went on.
Well, so now you graduated, if I remember right, from UCR.
I did, yes.
So did you make a conscious decision at that time to stay in the Inland Empire, or was that just where the biggest opportunity was?
So, I mean, for anyone that is newer to the area, it might be hard to imagine what the region was like in 1995, right? But a lot of the development that we see today was all fields, right? Rancho Cucamonga was, wineries or just dirt fields, and I mean, if you just drive through the Inland Empire, it was just a lot of land. And at that point in time, my junior year, I'd actually started interning at this office at Lee and Associates in Ontario. A friend of mine who was a year older than me had interned here, and he said, "Hey, I'm moving to San Diego. They're going to have a job opening. Put in your resume." And like of all things, we were like at a party, right? It was like a Saturday night, right? This is college, right? You know, we're having fun, and uh, I pursued it, but it was not like, real estate kind of found me. I didn't find real estate, and this was not a profession that, in college or even high school, people talked about as going into for a career path, right? There was no, like today, how many real estate shows are there? There's like $1 million listing, selling sunset, selling, there's multiple $1 million listing shows, New York and LA, and, everybody, oh man, look at these houses. And like people are understanding about real estate, but back then it was a sleeper industry, and I kind of fell into it, and have been thoroughly happy that it found me. You know.
So as you were getting into real estate, or even in college, I mean, who were you talked about the one professor you had? Who were the early mentors, and what do you think that they taught you that has stayed with you your entire career?
If you separated it between, like, I had some great teachers in, junior high school. I had some great soccer coaches. I did competitive soccer for many years when I was in junior high and high school, and our travel coach was just a tremendous influence. He was hard on us, but he loved us. And kind of that tough love, and get after it. Was always, in hindsight, really appreciated. Uh, in college, there were a few college is a little bit different because, sometimes you don't have that same personal relationship, with people. But getting out of college into the business world, I mean, I would say a lot of people that were in this office, that I was just, 19, 20, 21 years old starting off, and there were some founders of this office. One of the guys, unfortunately, recently passed away. A guy named John Earnhardt was a tremendous influence. In fact, I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't, for him and his brother Paul Earnhardt and his son Doug, who were early mentors of mine. When I was in the marketing department side, they always pushed and wanted to support our staff and what we did, and just, if you just kind of watch and listen from these guys, they're, legends in the industry. And so I definitely learned a lot from them and some of the other partners in the office at the time too. I don't think at the time I realized how much and how important those moments were. And then as you get older, you realize, how inspirational and important those moments and mentors are in your career. And, I was having a discussion last year with a few people, and I was looking back going, well, who am I going to mentor, and help out, and give that helping hand, in my next phase of my career for people that are now, starting out.
That's right. That's right.
That's kind of our job, to pass it on.
So, I know this is you and I first time really getting to sit down and talk, and with my background, I've been in real estate, some form of fashion, construction, sales, everything since I was a kid through my parents, that type of stuff. So, I definitely get where you're at, but I want to make sure for our listeners, walk us through, because you focus in the industrial world of real estate.
That's right.
So, we've got listeners that are going to be listening, and they invest and they're interested in anything real estate wise, right? So let's walk them through, or are we talking about warehouse, office, retail, multifamily, land? What is it that you specialize in?
So primarily industrial real estate and any land that you can put an industrial building on, right? And what I've seen, certainly in the Inland Empire, and I think you could say we've seen a lot of this nationally, is a shift with institutions and pension funds having a preference for industrial real estate. Multifamily has always been, popular, and does well in good times and in bad. Office, has had its ups and downs. Retail can have its ups and downs. The beauty about an industrial building is that you can repurpose it and reutilize it and re-tenant it if you're an investor very easily, right? Because it's a big box, and the company that was in there before, maybe they were a food processor, right? But when they move out, the next company that moves in, they can make, widgets, or they could be high precision machinery. They could be an e-commerce distribution company. The number of uses and things that you can do with an industrial building far surpasses, if you look at all the other categories of real estate in terms of the utility and the ability to reuse it for a different use. Multifamily, someone moves out, someone moves in. Office building, a group of attorneys moves out, you might have to demolish all the offices and build a brand new space plan. You're redesigning 90% of that footprint. Retail, restaurant moves in. What happens when a restaurant goes out of business and a new one comes in? You rebuild the whole thing, right? I mean, it's very costly. An industrial building, typically you don't have to have that expense on a percentage basis over the footprint. You might have to redo the offices and fix the dock high doors and paint and stuff like that, but generally speaking, I think it's the most resilient category of all the food groups of real estate.
So you've been in since 95. So you've been through a few cycles now. I'm interested to hear for you what it was like and how it differed from, say, the residential space.
So sometimes I get this question a lot about how the real estate cycles compared to each other. So for example, a lot of people might think that, residential and industrial parallel each other, right? And sometimes they do, and sometimes they are divergent from each other, just depending on what's going on. The big influences, on real estate in general are, interest rates and the willingness of lenders to lend on that real estate, right? So, I mean, you've been through a few cycles. There are moments in time when the lenders are very willing to give loans and very aggressive to do that. And then there are times when they go, nope, we're tightening up our purse strings, our lending requirements have become more stringent, we want a higher down payment. And when the lending when the lending gets restrictive, the prices take a hit. And it's not like, what's that movie? The Big Short,
right?
Where they go and they investigate how people are buying homes and they learn about what a ninja loan is, no income, no jobs, no assets. And that was the case in, 2004, 2005, 2006. A lot of people forget that, the first lenders that blew up during that time, I believe it was late 2006, right? Wasn't it like New Century Home Loan and a few others? And so there were tremors in the force, in 2006, but people, they didn't realize the impact. And then in 2007, they all came out on TV and said, oh, no, subprime's contained. Remember that? And couldn't be further from the truth, unfortunately.
Right.
But it's a cycle. And so for us, we're definitely tied to job creation, because when you're creating jobs, those jobs out here in the Inland Empire, they're going into industrial real estate, generally speaking. We have an office market here. It's not very large. Obviously, we have a big retail market. A lot of those are grocery-anchored shopping centers and strip malls and things like that. And, those tend to be pretty resilient in good times and bad, because everybody needs to eat, right? But on the industrial side, well, so for our market, what typically has happened in the past, so let's compare different cycles. So in the early 1990s, we had in late 80s, we had the savings and loan crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And for listeners that weren't around for that, and by the way, I was in college when that happened, so a lot of information that I get are stories from people that lived through that, right? But I came in at the tail end of that, and for people that don't know, back then, the federal government and lenders, they showed no mercy.
Yep.
Right? They took everything back. It was liquidate, liquidate, liquidate. The federal government formed the RTC, the Resolution Trust Corporation, and they took all those properties back. And then over a period of probably 4 or 5 years,
Mm-hmm.
they liquidated those assets, and a lot of people stepped in and bought those assets at a time when people, not everybody wanted to buy, and they came out looking very, very good. And so the difference between the 90s and the RTC versus, let's say, 2008 and the financial crisis, a lot of people may or may not remember who Sheila Bair is. Sheila was the chair of the FDIC at the time.
Yep.
And there was a statement she came out with, and they basically said their objective was to avoid a repeat of the 90s. They did not want to see a mass liquidation of commercial real estate. Residential real estate was a little bit different story. So that's where maybe the markets diverged a little bit, where on the commercial side, and credit to one of my partners here in the office, a guy named Brian Ferris, he educated me on this. In the financial crisis for industrial real estate, a lot of the lenders on those properties were not banks. They were pension funds, institutional advisors, money that could withstand a downturn, life insurance companies. And so there were not a lot of forced sales for big quality institutional assets. There were some distressed sales, but most of those were because they couldn't refinance their properties, right?
Right.
And so they couldn't roll over their debt, so they had to sell. They didn't want to sell, they had to sell. The difference between that and the residential side, right, which were all bank loans or banks that had blown up and then, been Pac-Maned by other banks, gobbled up by Bank of America or JP Morgan, go on. All the lenders like WAMU and the people that just kind of disappeared and blew up over a weekend, right? Those assets had to be liquidated,
Right.
right? So they if people don't remember, a lot of people lived in their homes for a year or two that had been struggling and got trapped in these loans that, they should have never been given to begin with, right? So, a lot of people would say, oh, they knew what they were getting. Maybe not, right? But the reality is that the lenders should have never given them the loans to begin with because they knew that they wouldn't be able to afford them. And unfortunately, they had to take back a lot of those homes. And I haven't heard this term in a while, but do you remember jingle mail?
Oh yes.
Where someone would live in their home for 2 years and then they didn't literally put their keys in the mail and send it back to the lender, but the lender would come and say, okay, it's time to go. And sometimes they would get paid to leave, but the properties would get liquidated. And then as the market recovered, you started seeing short sales again because the equity started to come back and then the market recovered. The industrial side, a lot of people thought we were going to get a repeat of the 90s. I remember having a lot of meetings with investors that had lived through the 90s and had put together big funds and hoping for a big liquidation, and it didn't happen. And some of those funds shifted from being opportunity funds and they became developers.
Right.
And they started buying land. And some of those people have been, some of the most successful real estate developers in this last cycle.
Well, so we're talking about some of this, I would imagine the first cycle you probably kind of went through was probably what the .com bust, somewhere around in there, around 2000. Yeah. So, the whole .com didn't have a major effect on the residential market. Walk me through what did that look like in the industrial? That was 2000. So what did that look like on the industrial space in the 2000 time period of that?
So it'd be easy to say that there was zero impact, right? But there's actually 2 deals that people may not be familiar with. And it was kind of at peak frenzy, right? In fact, this is a good story. So people may not remember this, but remember Toys R Us?
Oh, yeah.
Toys R Us had tried to do, toysrus.com.
Mm-hmm.
And in, I believe it was 1998, they started it. And in 1999, toysrus.com, they missed Christmas. I
remember
you ordered presents. Remember, you ordered presents for your kids, and it was a disaster.
Yep, I remember that.
I mean, the bad press they got at the time, and Toys R Us in early 2000, I believe it was, had come in and leased almost like a 750,000 square foot building in it might have been, it was early 2000, I believe, in Ontario, like Miraloma area.
Mm-hmm.
And then they also leased one, I believe, in Pennsylvania. Directly across the street, literally directly across the street, eToys. Remember eToys?
Yep.
Leased a 750,000 square foot building, right? And Toys R Us went in and spent, I believe it was like $20 million on this very sophisticated racking system to put in the building. And before they really got it up and running, the phone rings, ding, 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 ding. Hey, this is Jeff Bezos at Amazon. We'd really like to do all your fulfillment for ToysRUs.com. You guys really blew Christmas last year. Let me take it over. I'll take care of it. I got you. And he convinced Toys R Us to take over their fulfillment. And so after that happened, if you went to ToysRUs.com, you were basically getting fulfilled through Amazon.
Yep.
And so that facility, the Toys R Us facility, shut down. I think eToys went out of business 6 or 12 months later, right? So you had these two toy buildings that were sitting across from each other, both empty. Now, Toys R Us was still on the hook for the lease, right? They'd signed a long-term lease, and they'd put, tens of millions of dollars into, into this racking system, right? So one of my partners here in the office had done that deal right before I started working with them. And I just got my sales license. This is 2000. It's like August, I think. And he tells me, Erik, get the CFO for Walmart.com on the phone. We think that they could use this building, right? And they actually flew out here and looked at it, and they couldn't get to a deal, and then the market started to change, and that was kind of, the end of it. But those are probably two notable .com, .bomb deals that happened at the peak, of that cycle. But other than that,
I love your phrase .bomb.
well, in the office world, like in Santa Monica and other office heavy areas, there were companies that were ahead of their time. Like there was a company called Cosmo.com. Do you remember what their business model was?
Couldn't tell you, but I remember. I remember the brand, but I don't remember what it was.
Grocery delivery. You could go on their website and, I want a pizza and some ice cream and this and that, or whatever, and they would deliver it all, to your house or apartment or whatever. They were 25 years ahead of their time, right? And back then, you didn't have a mobile device to do it. You had to do it on your computer, right? So they had the right idea. They were just a little bit too early for their time, and they didn't make it. They had leased a lot of buildings around the area, but just because they didn't make it doesn't mean that they didn't have the right idea.
Wow.
I wouldn't be surprised if some of those people wound up at some of these other delivery companies. I don't know that. That's my speculation, but it's pretty crazy.
I did not know that about Cosmos. That's pretty interesting stuff. So how did the industrial space bounce back? Was there a major catalyst for that?
So here's an interesting thing. In 2000, California was coming out of a real estate depression. Remember, we just talked about the RTC, the liquidation of real estate, and it was bad.
Right.
And so price was just starting to recover. In 2000, I remember going to a conference, and there were, people there from all over the country, and they were talking about the recession that we were in. And like the people from California, we all looked at each other and we said, what recession? And in 2000, it was a rolling recession. It kind of started on the East Coast. And this was the first wave of manufacturing towns getting shut down and manufacturing capacity getting moved overseas. At that point, it was Mexico and the maquiladoras they were building, different cities in Mexico, and then eventually went from there to China, right? So back then, the guys that were and ladies that were telling me that they were, struggling in these towns were North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, these towns that had been, manufacturing towns for many years. And I remember one of the guys from North Carolina, he said, I'll never forget it. He said, I wish instead of trying to find another furniture company to move into this particular plant in North Carolina that had shut down, he said, I wish they would just demolish it. Because when people see that, they think that another company is going to come in and start making furniture again. And he said, and this is in 2000, by the way, and he said, maybe it was 2001. I could be off on the year. He said, it's not going to happen. And looking back, he was right and then some. And in 2001, the market was soft. We were starting to see it. And I remember I had a project that I was the junior guy on with my partners in Chino.
Okay.
We had like 10 or 12 buildings under construction, and we were selling them, and we had sold most of them. And one of the buildings had been bought by an investor, and he decided he wanted to flip it. And I think he wanted $75 per square foot at the time. And I had a client, and I could only get him up to about $71. And we just kind of got to a stalemate. This was August of 2001. Okay.
Okay.
And then 9/11 happened. And for anybody that was in the business world at that point in time, I remember coming into the office that day. I wasn't even sure if I should come in, right? Because
Right.
I was glued to the television that morning, and there was an alert for LAX. We didn't know if another building was going to get hit. My dad got stranded in, I think, New Mexico, and my dad's a really smart guy. He was at the airport, and he walked right to the rental car desk. Give me whatever you have. And he drove himself home. I think it might have been the day after, actually. I'd have to go back and ask him which day it was actually that he was supposed to come home. But, remember, all the rental car lots, no cars.
Yep.
So during that period of time after 9/11, it was, it's kind of a very scary time because you didn't know what was going to happen. There were, people stranded all over the world. One of my buddies, we were doing a high school reunion. That would have been our 10-year high school reunion at the Queen Mary, 2 weeks from 9/11. And people were calling me going, hey, are we still going to do this? And someone asked me, can you guarantee my safety on the Queen Mary? And I was like, no, I can't do that. And there were people that were trying to get here from all over the country. And the flights started running, I think, that Friday before our reunion. One of my buddies had literally got stranded on the tarmac in the Philippines.
Wow.
And he made it back at LAX, but he landed at like 11 o'clock at night, so he didn't make it to the reunion. Other people were flying in from Florida and in other states, barely made it. But the point of the story is, after 9/11, Alan Greenspan, the interest rates dropped like a rock, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like what we saw in the financial crisis, and then during COVID, when people are captivated by fear. The Fed, they come in and they drop interest rates as low as they can because they want to get people to spend money. Because if everybody stops spending money, it just becomes, a tailspin, right? Everything goes into a tailspin. And so I'd have to go back and look to see how many rate cuts they did in that first month or two, but it was very dramatic. I want to say they dropped them like 100, maybe 50 or 100 basis points within that first couple of weeks, and then they dropped them again, I think, an emergency rate cut in between meetings. But the rates had dropped so fast that I called a lender that I'd been working with on this deal in Chino. And I said, hey, can you run the numbers again and tell me what the loan payment would be if the buyer stepped up and paid $75 per square foot? Because we were at an impasse.
Right.
He was like at 69 or 70, seller wanted 75. And the lender called me back a couple hours later. And I had done the math, but I wanted her to do the workup to send to the client so she could see that it was the lender, saying it, not me, right? And the payment was actually less per month at $75 a foot than it would have been before the interest rates dropped. So I called the buyer and I said, Mike, I just talked to Joan, and, do you still need a building? And he realized, well, I do still need a building. I said, if he'll sell it at 75, do you want to buy it? And he said, you know what, let me think about it. And he and his wife talked. He called me back. He said, you know what, we'll take it. And I called the broker and I said, Jim, I think we got a deal. Is your guy still a seller? And that was the first building I sold after 9/11.
Wow.
And we were off to the races, right? That was November 2001.
For more information on hard money loans, trust deed investing, and upcoming events with the Norris Group, check out thenorrisgroup.com. For more information on passive investing through the DBL Capital Real Estate Investment Fund, please visit dblcapital.com.
The Norris Group originates and services loans in California and Florida under the California DRE license 01219911, Florida Mortgage Lender License 1577, and NMLS License 1623669. For more information on hard money lending, go to thenorrisgroup.com and click the Hard Money tab.